Welcome. Your opinion truly matters to us. At the end, rate the story from 0 to 10 and don't forget to subscribe. Now, let's begin the story. Margaret clutched her tablet, reviewing the morning's agenda. She'd made this journey countless times, but today felt different, though she couldn't quite pinpoint why. Perhaps it was the way her boss, Richard Blackwell, had been acting lately, or maybe it was just the lingering taste of the gas station coffee she'd grabbed on her way in. "Margaret!" Richard's voice boomed across the hallway the moment the elevator doors parted. He was already striding toward her, his Italian leather shoes clicking against the marble floor with the precision of a metronome. In his hand, a steaming cup of what she knew was his ridiculously expensive Ethiopian blend, the kind that cost more per pound than most people's weekly grocery budget. "Good morning, Mr. Blackwell," she replied, adjusting her grip on the tablet. "I have the Morrison contracts ready for—" "Did you send the quarterly reports to Henderson?" he interrupted, not slowing his pace. They were walking toward his corner office now, and Margaret noticed he was holding the coffee cup at an odd angle, almost carelessly. "Yes, sir. Yesterday evening, as requested. He confirmed receipt this morning and—" Richard stopped abruptly, causing Margaret to nearly collide with his broad frame. He turned to face her, and for a split second, she caught something peculiar in his expression. Not anger, not frustration, something more calculated, deliberate. "You know, Margaret," he said, his voice dropping to a conversational tone that somehow felt more unsettling than his usual bark. "I've been thinking about your performance lately." Margaret's stomach tightened. Performance reviews weren't scheduled for another 3 months. "Sir? Your attention to detail, your dedication." He was studying her face now, and she fought the urge to check if she had something stuck in her teeth. "Tell me, what did you think of the Henderson proposal?" This was weird. Richard never asked for her opinions on major deals. She was his secretary, not his business advisor. Well, the numbers seemed solid and the timeline appeared realistic. That's when it happened. The coffee cup tilted, and its contents cascaded down like a caffeinated waterfall, splashing directly onto Margaret's head and shoulders. The liquid was hot, not scalding, but uncomfortably warm, and it soaked through her carefully pressed blouse and into her hair, which she'd spent 20 minutes styling that morning. "Oh!" Richard exclaimed, but his surprise seemed oddly rehearsed, like a community theater actor who'd forgotten to practice his lines. "How clumsy of me. I'm so sorry, Margaret." Margaret stood there, dripping, feeling the coffee seep through her clothing and pool around her feet. The smell was overwhelming, rich, earthy, and now permanently associated with this moment of humiliation. She could feel eyes on her from the nearby cubicles, though no one dared to stare directly. Her first instinct was to cry. Her second was to scream. Her third was to grab Richard by his perfectly knotted tie and demand to know what kind of psychological game he was playing. Instead, she smiled. "No problem at all, Mr. Blackwell," she said, her voice steady despite the coffee still dripping from her chin. "Accidents happen." Richard blinked, clearly caught off guard by her reaction. Yes, well, perhaps you should go clean up. Take your time." "Thank you, sir. I'll just grab some paper towels from the break room." Margaret maintained her smile, even as she felt a drop of coffee roll down her spine. "Should I reschedule your 10:30 with the board members?" No, that won't be necessary." Richard was already backing toward his office, as if afraid she might suddenly explode like a coffee-soaked volcano. "Just clean up. We'll discuss the Henderson proposal later." Margaret nodded and turned toward the break room, her wet shoes squeaking against the floor. Behind her, she heard Richard's office door close with a definitive click. In the break room, she caught her reflection in the microwave's black surface. Coffee had turned her light brown hair several shades darker, and her white blouse was now a Jackson Pollock painting in various shades of brown. She looked like she'd been dunked in a vat of espresso. "Rough morning?" Margaret turned to find Jessica Chen, the head of HR, standing in the doorway with a sympathetic expression and an armful of paper towels. You could say that, Margaret replied, accepting the towels gratefully. Though I have to admit, it's not the weirdest thing that's happened to me this week. Oh? Jessica raised an eyebrow, moving closer to help dab at Margaret's shoulders. Do tell. Margaret paused, studying Jessica's face. There was something in her expression, a knowing look that suggested she might understand more about the situation than she was letting on. Let's just say I'm starting to think my boss has some interesting ideas about employee relations. Jessica's hands stilled for a moment. Interesting how? The kind of interesting that makes you wonder if someone's playing a game you don't know the rules to, Margaret said carefully. A strange smile crossed Jessica's lips. Games can be fun, she said, resuming her dabbing, especially when you figure out how to play them better than the person who started them. Margaret met Jessica's eyes in the reflection of the microwave's surface. There was definitely something there, an understanding, perhaps even an alliance in the making. Thanks for the help, Margaret said, taking the used paper towels and tossing them in the trash. I should probably go find some dry clothes. Margaret? Jessica called as she reached the doorway. If you ever want to grab lunch sometime, I know a great little place downtown. Quiet. Good for conversation. Margaret nodded slowly. I'd like that. As she walked back toward her desk, still damp but no longer dripping, Margaret's mind was racing. The coffee incident hadn't been an accident. She was certain of that now. But what Richard didn't realize was that he'd just made the biggest mistake of his professional life. Because Margaret Patterson had an excellent memory, unlimited access to his calendar and correspondence, and now, apparently, an ally in HR who seemed to understand exactly what kind of game they were all playing. The day was still young, and Margaret was just getting started. Margaret had learned long ago that being invisible was a superpower in the corporate world. Secretaries were like office furniture, essential but rarely noticed when they were functioning properly. This particular talent had served her well over the past 3 years working for Richard Blackwell, but today she was putting it to exceptional use. After changing into the spare blouse she kept in her desk drawer, a lesson learned from a previous coffee-related incident, though that one had genuinely been accidental, Margaret had positioned herself at her workstation with surgical precision. Her desk sat just outside Richard's office, close enough to overhear phone conversations when his voice rose, which it often did, and positioned perfectly to observe the comings and goings of his visitors. At 11:47 a.m., exactly 17 minutes after the coffee incident, Jessica Chen appeared at Margaret's desk, wearing a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "How are you feeling?" Jessica asked, perching on the edge of Margaret's desk in a way that seemed casual, but blocked the view from Richard's office window. "No burns, I hope." "Just my pride," Margaret replied, though they both knew that wasn't entirely true. "Thank you again for the help." "Of course." Jessica lowered her voice slightly. "I was wondering, do you happen to know if Mr. Blackwell has any meetings scheduled with external consultants this week? I'm trying to coordinate some HR policy updates, and I want to make sure we're not stepping on any toes." Margaret's fingers paused over her keyboard. She knew Richard's schedule better than he did, and there were no external consultants scheduled. But Jessica's question felt loaded, like she was fishing for something specific. "Not that I'm aware of," Margaret said carefully. "Why? Is there something I should know about?" Jessica's smile became more genuine. "Oh, you know how it is. Office rumors and all that. People talking about policy changes, restructuring." She paused meaningfully. "Personnel adjustments." The phrase hung in the air between them like a soap bubble waiting to pop. Personnel adjustments. In corporate speak, that could mean anything from promotions to terminations. But given the morning's events, Margaret had a sinking feeling it might mean something more personal. "I see," Margaret said. "Well, if anything like that comes across my desk, I'll be sure to let you know. I'd appreciate that." Jessica stood, smoothing down her skirt. "And Margaret, that lunch invitation still stands. Maybe Thursday?" Before Margaret could respond, Richard's office door opened with more force than necessary, and he emerged looking like a man who'd just discovered his favorite restaurant had permanently run out of his usual order. "Margaret!" he barked, completely ignoring Jessica's presence. "I need you to reschedule my 2 o'clock with Davidson. Move it to tomorrow, same time." "Of course, sir." Margaret was already reaching for her phone. "Should I mention a reason for the change?" "Tell him something came up. Family matter." Richard's eyes flicked to Jessica, who was still standing by Margaret's desk. "Ms. Chen, don't you have somewhere to be?" Jessica's smile could have powered a small city. "Actually, I was just discussing some policy updates with Margaret. Nothing urgent, of course." "Policy updates?" Richard's voice had taken on a tone Margaret recognized, the same one he used when reviewing contracts he suspected contained hidden clauses. "Standard HR procedures," Jessica replied smoothly. "Employee relations, workplace conduct, that sort of thing. I'm sure you understand the importance of maintaining proper professional boundaries." The temperature in the hallway seemed to drop several degrees. Margaret watched the exchange like a tennis match, noting how Richard's jaw tightened and how Jessica's posture remained perfectly relaxed despite the obvious tension. "Yes, well," Richard said finally. "I'm sure Margaret has more pressing matters to attend to than HR bureaucracy." "Of course." Jessica gathered her folders from Margaret's desk. "Margaret, think about Thursday, will you? I know a place that serves excellent salads. Very enlightening atmosphere." After Jessica left, Richard stood in his doorway for a long moment, staring down the hallway where she'd disappeared. Margaret pretended to be absorbed in her computer screen, but she was actually watching his reflection in her monitor. His expression was unreadable, but his hands were clenched into fists at his sides. "Margaret," he said suddenly. "Yes, sir?" "How long have you been working here?" The question seemed innocent enough, but Margaret's instincts were screaming that it wasn't. 3 years, 2 months, and 16 days, she replied without hesitation. Richard turned to look at her, and she met his gaze with what she hoped was professional neutrality. "And in all that time, have you ever felt dissatisfied with your position?" Margaret's heart began to race, but her voice remained steady. "I'm very happy with my job, Mr. Blackwell. Is there something specific you'd like me to improve?" No, he said quickly. "I just want to make sure you're comfortable here, that you feel valued." "I do, sir, very much so." Richard nodded slowly, but his eyes remained fixed on her face, as if he were trying to read a document written in a foreign language. "Good, that's good." He retreated to his office, leaving Margaret alone with her thoughts, and a growing sense that she'd just passed some kind of test without fully understanding what had been at stake. At 2:15 p.m., while Richard was presumably dealing with whatever family matter had required rescheduling his meeting, Margaret strongly suspected there was no family matter, she made a decision that would have seemed impossible that morning. She opened Richard's appointment calendar and began to study it with the intensity of a forensic accountant examining suspicious transactions. 3 years of loyal service had earned her complete access to his schedule, his contact lists, and his correspondence filing system. He trusted her implicitly, which had always been a source of pride. Today, it felt more like a weapon. The patterns were subtle, but they were there once she knew what to look for. Recurring appointments labeled only as executive consultation, with no client name attached. Lunch meetings that lasted 3 hours with no follow-up notes. Conference calls scheduled during times when she knew he was in the office but had asked not to be disturbed. And then there were the expenses. Margaret handled Richard's corporate credit card reconciliation, and she'd always been impressed by his fiscal responsibility. He wasn't the type to charge personal expenses to the company account, but looking at the charges with fresh eyes, certain patterns emerged. The same high-end restaurant, always at lunch, always for 2 people. A florist with deliveries to an address that wasn't the company, wasn't his home, and wasn't any client she recognized. Hotel charges for conference rooms that, upon closer inspection, weren't actually conference rooms at all. Margaret leaned back in her chair, staring at her computer screen. The evidence was circumstantial but compelling. Richard Blackwell, devoted family man and pillar of corporate integrity, was having an affair. And if her growing suspicions about Jessica Chen were correct, she wasn't the only one who had figured it out. Her phone buzzed with a text message. "Still thinking about Thursday lunch? I have some interesting stories about corporate policy violations. Jay." Margaret looked at the message for a long moment, then typed back, "Thursday sounds perfect. I have some stories of my own." As she hit send, Margaret realized she was smiling for the first time since the coffee incident. Richard Blackwell had no idea what he'd set in motion when he decided to humiliate her this morning. He'd awakened something in her that had been dormant for 3 years of loyal, invisible service. He'd awakened her survival instincts, and Margaret Patterson had always been very good at surviving. The restaurant Jessica had chosen was the kind of place that served quinoa salads for $30 and attracted the sort of clientele who discussed their therapists over organic kombucha. Margaret had never been somewhere so aggressively healthy in her life, but she had to admit the atmosphere was perfect for their purposes, intimate enough for private conversation, yet public enough to avoid suspicion. "You look better," Jessica observed, as Margaret slid into the booth across from her. "Less caffeinated," Margaret laughed despite herself. "I've switched to tea, temporarily." "Wise choice." Jessica was already nursing what appeared to be a green smoothie that looked like it had been extracted from a lawnmower. "I took the liberty of ordering for both of us. Hope you don't mind kale. At this point, I'm open to new experiences." They made small talk until their salads arrived, elaborate constructions that seemed to have been assembled by someone with a background in floral arrangement. Margaret poked at what she thought might be a pomegranate seed and decided to cut to the chase. "So," she said, keeping her voice low, "about those policy violations you mentioned." Jessica's fork paused halfway to her mouth. "Direct. I like that." She chewed thoughtfully, then leaned forward. "Tell me, Margaret, what do you know about Richard's relationship with his wife?" The question caught Margaret off guard. She'd expected Jessica to discuss workplace conduct, maybe some inappropriate behavior she'd witnessed. "I know she exists? Catherine, right? I've seen her at company events." Catherine Blackwell, 42 years old, former marketing executive, currently serves on 3 different charity boards and runs a very successful interior design consultation business. Jessica recited the information like she was reading from a file. They've been married for 15 years, 2 children, both in private school, beautiful home in Westchester, worth approximately $2.7 million. Margaret set down her fork. "You've done your homework. It's my job to know these things. Personnel files contain emergency contacts, insurance beneficiaries, references to family members." Jessica's smile was razor sharp. "Amazing what you can piece together when you actually pay attention." "And what exactly have you pieced together?" Jessica reached into her purse and withdrew a tablet, which she angled so only Margaret could see the screen. "Expense reports from the past 8 months. Notice anything interesting?" Margaret studied the data, her trained eye automatically cataloging the patterns she'd begun to recognize from her own investigation. But Jessica's version was far more comprehensive, cross-referenced with company policies, and highlighted with digital annotations. "The Meridian Hotel," Margaret said slowly. "He's been there 14 times since September." "Conference room rentals," Jessica confirmed. "Except the Meridian doesn't rent conference rooms by the hour, and they certainly don't provide champagne service for business meetings." Margaret felt a chill that had nothing to do with the restaurant's aggressive air conditioning. "You think he's—" "I don't think anything," Jessica said firmly. "I have evidence. Would you like to see more?" Against her better judgment, Margaret nodded. Jessica swiped to a new screen, revealing what appeared to be a collection of email headers and timestamps. Corporate email system maintains logs of all messages sent and received. Standard IT security protocol. "You have access to his emails?" "I have access to metadata, dates, times, recipients, subject lines. I can't read the content, but I can see patterns." Jessica highlighted several entries with her finger. Notice how many messages he's exchanged with our head of HR in the past 6 months. Margaret squinted at the screen. Wait, that says head of HR, but you're the head of HR. Jessica's smile became predatory. Exactly. The implications hit Margaret like a second cup of coffee to the face. He's been emailing with you? Not me, specifically. My predecessor. Jessica's voice had taken on a tone that could have frozen the restaurant's green smoothies solid. Vanessa Morrison left the company rather suddenly in January. Personal reasons, according to the official record. Margaret's mind raced through the timeline. January was when she'd noticed the first changes in Richard's behavior, the mysterious meetings, the increased secrecy, the subtle shift in his treatment of female employees. You think he was having an affair with Vanessa? I think Richard Blackwell has a pattern, Jessica said, closing the tablet and sliding it back into her purse. And I think that pattern is about to bite him in his very expensive ass. Margaret stared at her salad, which suddenly looked even less appetizing than before. Why are you telling me this? Because you're next. The words hung between them like a toxic cloud. Margaret's throat felt dry despite the fact that she hadn't touched her overpriced sparkling water. I'm sorry? The coffee incident wasn't random, Margaret. It was a test. Jessica leaned back against the booth's cushions, her expression becoming almost clinical. Richard has a very specific methodology. First, he creates a situation where a female employee is dependent on his goodwill. Humiliation followed by apparent kindness. Then he escalates to private meetings, personal conversations, small gifts or favors. Margaret thought about Richard's strange questions the day before, his inquiry about her job satisfaction, his sudden concern for her comfort level. You're saying he was grooming me? I'm saying he's following the same playbook he used with Vanessa. Jessica's voice softened slightly. The same playbook he tried to use with 2 other employees before her, both of whom ended up leaving the company after filing complaints that mysteriously disappeared from their personnel files. Margaret felt nauseated, and for once it wasn't because of the restaurant's commitment to organic vegetables. How do you know all this? Because I'm very, very good at my job, and because Vanessa Morrison wasn't as discreet as she thought she was. Jessica reached across the table and touched Margaret's hand gently. She kept records, Margaret. Detailed records, screenshots, printed emails, even some audio recordings. Where are they now? Safe. Very safe. Jessica's grip tightened almost imperceptibly. And they're going to stay that way unless Richard decides to make another mistake. Margaret pulled her hand back, her mind spinning. You're planning to blackmail him? I'm planning to protect other women from going through what Vanessa went through. What you almost went through. Jessica's eyes hardened. Richard Blackwell thinks he's untouchable because he's rich, because he's charming, because he's managed to convince everyone that he's a devoted family man. But he's not untouchable, Margaret. He's just been lucky. And his luck is about to run out? That depends, Jessica said, signaling for the check, on whether you're willing to help me make sure it does. Margaret stared at her barely touched salad, trying to process everything she'd learned. An hour ago, she'd thought she was having lunch with a colleague who might be able to help her understand her boss's strange behavior. Now she was sitting across from someone who had apparently been conducting a covert investigation into corporate sexual harassment and planning what sounded suspiciously like revenge. What exactly are you asking me to do? Nothing illegal, Jessica said quickly. Nothing that would put you at risk professionally. I just need you to keep doing what you've been doing for 3 years, being Richard's perfect, invisible, trusted secretary. And when he makes his next move, which he will, I need you to document it. Every meeting, every inappropriate comment, every time he looks at you the wrong way. Jessica's smile returned, but this time it reminded Margaret of a shark that had just smelled blood in the water. Richard Blackwell is about to discover that some people fight back. Margaret thought about the coffee dripping down her face. about Richard's calculated cruelty, about the other women who had apparently suffered through his attention before her. She thought about Catherine Blackwell, unknowingly married to a predator, and about the children who thought their father was a hero. "What about his wife?" she asked finally. Jessica's expression became unreadable. "What about her? Does she know about any of this?" "Catherine Blackwell is a very intelligent woman," Jessica said carefully. "She's also very invested in maintaining her lifestyle and her social position. Whether she knows or suspects anything is complicated. But she deserves to know the truth." "Yes," Jessica agreed. "She does. And when the time is right, she'll get it." Margaret nodded slowly, feeling like she was signing an invisible contract she couldn't quite read. "Okay. I'm in." Jessica's smile was brilliant and slightly terrifying. "Excellent. Oh, and Margaret." "Yes?" "You might want to start carrying a small recording device, just in case Richard decides to be more direct with his next approach." As they left the restaurant, Margaret felt like she was walking into a completely different world than the one she'd inhabited that morning. The sun seemed brighter, the air felt charged with possibility, and for the first time in 3 years, she felt like she had real power. Richard Blackwell had no idea what he'd unleashed when he poured that coffee on her head. But he was about to find out. And Margaret found herself looking forward to his education with an enthusiasm that probably should have worried her more than it did. Margaret had never owned a recording device in her life, but by Friday afternoon, she possessed what Jessica assured her was a state-of-the-art digital recorder disguised as a pen. It felt heavier than it looked, weighted with the promise of secrets yet to be captured. "Just click the top twice," Jessica had explained during their brief encounter by the elevator. "It records for up to 4 hours and uploads automatically to a secure cloud server." Very spy movie, don't you think? What Margaret thought was that she was either about to become a hero or ruin her life completely, but she kept that observation to herself. Richard's behavior over the past 2 days had been a masterclass in psychological manipulation, exactly as Jessica had predicted. Thursday, he'd sent her an expensive bouquet of flowers with a note apologizing again for the unfortunate accident. Friday morning, he'd brought her coffee from that boutique place downtown, the one that charged $8 for a cup and made you feel grateful for the privilege. "I thought you might be developing an aversion," he'd said, with what she now recognized as his calculated charm smile. "Can't have my best secretary afraid of caffeine, can we?" Margaret had accepted the coffee graciously and poured it into her desk plant the moment he returned to his office. The poor ficus was probably going to develop an addiction, but it seemed like a worthy sacrifice. At 3:17 p.m., Richard emerged from his office wearing the expression of a man who'd just had a very interesting phone call. "Margaret, I need you to stay late tonight. We have some sensitive documents to review, and I'd prefer to handle them when the office is quieter." Margaret's hand instinctively moved toward the pen in her shirt pocket. "Of course, Mr. Blackwell. What time should I plan to stay until?" "Let's say 7:30, maybe 8. His smile was warm, paternal almost. "I'll order dinner for us. Can't have you working on an empty stomach." "That's very thoughtful, sir. I try to take care of my people, Margaret, especially the ones who show real dedication." After he disappeared back into his office, Margaret texted Jessica, "It's happening. Tonight. 7:30. The response came back almost immediately. "Perfect. Remember, let him lead the conversation. Don't seem eager or suspicious. And Margaret? Yes? Be careful. He's more dangerous when he thinks he's winning." The rest of the afternoon crawled by with the speed of continental drift. Margaret tried to maintain her usual efficiency, but her mind kept wandering to what the evening might bring. She'd reviewed Jessica's briefing materials so many times she could recite them from memory. Richard's pattern of escalation, his preferred methods of isolation, the specific language he used to test boundaries. At 6:45 p.m., the office had emptied except for security and the overnight cleaning crew. Margaret had changed into the spare blouse again. She was starting to think of it as her armor, and positioned herself at her desk with a stack of files that didn't actually need reviewing. Richard emerged from his office at exactly 7:30, carrying a bottle of wine and wearing an expression she'd never seen before. Not his professional mask, not his calculated charm, but something rawer, hungrier. "Margaret, perfect timing." He set the wine on her desk next to a bag from what she recognized as the city's most expensive Italian restaurant. "I thought we could work in the conference room. More space to spread out the documents." The conference room was on the far side of the building, isolated from the security cameras and the cleaning crew's normal routes. Margaret had suspected he'd suggest it. "Of course, sir. Should I bring my notebook?" "Just bring yourself. I have everything we need." Margaret gathered her things, making sure the recording pen was easily accessible, and followed Richard down the dimly lit hallway. The conference room was smaller than she remembered, dominated by a polished mahogany table that reflected the overhead lights like a dark mirror. Richard had already set out the food, osso buco that smelled incredible, and probably cost more than Margaret's weekly salary. He'd also opened the wine, a red that looked older than her car. "This is very generous, Mr. Blackwell," Margaret said, settling into the chair he indicated. It was positioned so her back was to the door, she noticed. Classic power positioning. "Please, call me Richard. We're working late after all. No need for formality." He poured wine into 2 glasses, filling hers significantly more than his own. "I want to talk to you about your future here, Margaret." "My future?" "You've been my secretary for over 3 years. That's longer than most people stay in support positions." Richard leaned back in his chair, studying her face. "I've been thinking it might be time for a promotion. Something with more responsibility, more personal involvement in my business operations." Margaret sipped her wine, which was admittedly spectacular, and tried to look intrigued rather than nauseous. "What kind of responsibilities?" "Executive assistant level. Your own office, substantial salary increase, travel opportunities." Richard's voice had taken on the tone of a car salesman closing a deal. "I do a lot of business travel, Margaret. Client meetings, conferences, investment opportunities. I need someone I can trust implicitly. Someone who understands discretion." "Discretion?" "Business relationships can be complex, sensitive. Sometimes what happens during business trips needs to stay confidential." Richard leaned forward, his eyes never leaving her face. "Client entertainment, for instance. Building personal relationships that facilitate professional success." Margaret felt the recording pen's weight against her ribs and clicked it twice, praying the motion wasn't visible. "I understand the importance of confidentiality, sir." "Richard," he corrected gently. "And I'm sure you do. You've always been very observant, very discreet about things you've seen or heard." The comment felt loaded with meaning, and Margaret realized he might be testing whether she'd noticed his suspicious meetings and expenses. "I believe in maintaining professional boundaries." "Boundaries?" Richard smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "That's interesting phrasing. Tell me, Margaret, what do you consider appropriate professional boundaries?" This was it. The moment Jessica had warned her about, when Richard would begin probing for weaknesses, testing her reaction to increasingly inappropriate suggestions. "I suppose that depends on the context," Margaret said carefully. "Different industries have different standards." "Exactly." Richard seemed pleased by her answer. "In our industry, success often depends on personal relationships. Trust, intimacy even." He reached across the table and touched her hand briefly. "I've always believed that the most successful business partnerships are built on mutual understanding, shared experiences." Margaret didn't pull her hand away, though every instinct screamed at her to do so. "Shared experiences. Travel, as I mentioned, but also social situations, entertainment. Sometimes clients expect a certain level of personal attention." Richard's thumb traced across her knuckles before he withdrew his hand. "The previous assistant who traveled with me understood this very well. Vanessa Morrison. He was talking about Vanessa Morrison. She sounds very professional, Margaret managed. She was very accommodating, very flexible about the requirements of the position. Richard refilled her wine glass, though she'd barely touched it. Unfortunately, she decided to pursue other opportunities. Personal reasons, she said. Margaret wondered if personal reasons meant threatened to file a sexual harassment lawsuit, but she kept her expression neutral. That must have been disappointing for you. It was, which is why I'm being very careful about her replacement. Richard's gaze had become intense, almost predatory. I need someone who won't be shocked by the realities of high-level business relationships. Someone mature enough to handle complex situations. Complex how? Richard stood and walked around the table, stopping behind Margaret's chair. She felt his presence like a physical weight, her skin crawling with the awareness of his proximity. Sometimes, Margaret, success requires sacrifices, compromises, a willingness to go above and beyond traditional job descriptions. His hand settled on her shoulders, and she had to fight every survival instinct she possessed not to bolt from the room. The question is, are you willing to make those sacrifices for your career? Margaret's mind raced. She could feel the recording device capturing every word, every inflection that would damn Richard in any court or boardroom, but she also felt trapped, isolated, with a predator literally breathing down her neck. I'm very committed to my career, she said, proud that her voice remained steady. Good. That's very good. Richard's hands moved slightly, his thumbs pressing against the base of her neck. Because I have a business trip planned for next month. Chicago. Very important clients. I think it would be an excellent opportunity for you to demonstrate your commitment. This was the moment. The explicit proposition Jessica had said would come. Margaret felt like she was standing on the edge of a cliff, knowing she had to jump, but terrified of the landing. What would that demonstration involve? Richard's laugh was low, intimate, disgusting. Let's just say that client entertainment in Chicago tends to be very personal, very hands-on. His grip tightened slightly. But I think you're ready for that level of responsibility, don't you? Before Margaret could answer, before she could figure out how to extract herself from his grip without blowing her cover, the conference room door opened with a sharp click. Oh, I'm so sorry to interrupt. Margaret's head snapped toward the voice, and her heart nearly stopped. Standing in the doorway, looking perfectly composed despite the obvious shock in her eyes, was Catherine Blackwell. Richard's hands flew away from Margaret's shoulders as if she'd suddenly burst into flames. Catherine, what are you doing here? Catherine Blackwell was even more striking in person than in the company photos Margaret had seen. Tall, elegant, with silver-streaked auburn hair and the kind of bone structure that suggested good genetics and excellent skincare. She was wearing a charcoal wool coat that probably cost more than Margaret's monthly rent, and carrying a leather purse that looked like it had been crafted by angels. I came to surprise you with dinner, Catherine said, her voice carefully controlled. I called your office, but there was no answer, so I thought I'd come up. Security let me in. Her gaze moved from Richard to Margaret and back again. I see you're already eating. Yes, we're working late. Important documents to review. Richard was already moving toward his wife, his hands outstretched in a gesture that looked more defensive than welcoming. Margaret was just helping me with some sensitive contracts. How dedicated of her. Catherine's smile was razor-sharp. I don't believe we've been properly introduced. I'm Catherine Blackwell. Margaret stood on shaking legs, grateful to be free of Richard's proximity. Margaret Patterson. I'm your husband's secretary. Executive assistant, actually, Richard corrected quickly. Margaret is being promoted. We were just discussing her new responsibilities. How wonderful. Catherine's eyes were studying the conference room, the expensive food, the opened wine, the intimate seating arrangement, with the efficiency of a crime scene investigator. What kind of new responsibilities? The question hung in the air like a loaded weapon. Margaret realized that Catherine Blackwell knew exactly what she'd walked into, and was giving both her husband and his secretary a chance to explain themselves. Richard opened his mouth to respond, but Margaret beat him to it. Mr. Blackwell was explaining some of the travel requirements for the position, she said calmly. Client entertainment and such. I see. Catherine's gaze settled on Margaret with something that might have been approval. And are you looking forward to those travel opportunities, Margaret? Margaret met Catherine's eyes and saw something there, a flash of understanding, of shared knowledge about the man they were both dealing with. Actually, Mrs. Blackwell, Margaret said with a smile that felt surprisingly genuine, I've been reconsidering whether travel is really the right fit for my career goals. Catherine's answering smile was brilliant and slightly terrifying. How wise of you, she said. I've always found that some business trips can be far more complicated than they initially appear. The silence that followed Catherine's observation stretched like a tightrope over a canyon, with all three of them balanced precariously on its edge. Margaret could hear the building's air conditioning humming, the distant sound of a vacuum cleaner from the cleaning crew, and what she was fairly certain was the sound of Richard's carefully constructed world beginning to crumble. Catherine, Richard began, his voice taking on the tone of a man trying to explain why he'd been found standing over a body while holding a smoking gun. This isn't what it looks like. Catherine set her purse down on the conference table with deliberate precision, right next to the expensive wine Richard had opened for his seduction dinner. Really? Because it looks like you're having an intimate dinner with your secretary in an isolated conference room after hours, having just had your hands on her shoulders in a way that seemed distinctly unprofessional. Margaret watched this exchange with fascination and growing horror. Catherine wasn't surprised by what she'd found. She was angry about it, but not surprised, which meant Jessica had been right about Catherine's intelligence and wrong about her ignorance. We were discussing her promotion, Richard said, his desperation becoming more apparent with each word. The travel requirements, the client entertainment aspects. The same aspects you discussed with Vanessa Morrison? Catherine's voice could have frozen lava. The same client entertainment that required those monthly trips to Chicago and Miami? The same promotion opportunities that led to her sudden departure? Richard's face went white. How did I know? Catherine laughed, but it was the kind of laugh that suggested someone was about to die and it wasn't going to be her. Richard, darling, I've known about your extracurricular activities for months. Did you really think I wouldn't notice the credit card charges, the mysterious meetings, the way you've been treating your female employees like items on a buffet? Margaret felt like she was watching a masterclass in controlled fury. Catherine Blackwell was dismantling her husband with surgical precision, and Margaret was beginning to suspect she'd been planning this moment for far longer than anyone realized. I can explain, Richard said weakly. Oh, I'm sure you can. You always could explain things, couldn't you? The flowers charged to the company account weren't for clients. They were for office morale. The hotel rooms weren't for affairs. They were for private business meetings. The jewelry purchases weren't gifts for your mistresses. They were client appreciation tokens. Catherine picked up the wine bottle and examined the label. 1998 Barolo. $63 a bottle, charged to the company account yesterday afternoon. Richard's mouth opened and closed like a fish drowning in air. Margaret realized she was still clutching the recording pen and wondered if she should mention that she'd captured Richard's entire seduction attempt on digital audio. Probably not the best moment to bring up additional evidence of his misconduct. Catherine, please, Richard said, reaching toward his wife. We can work this out. We can go to counseling. We can get divorced, Catherine said pleasantly. Which is exactly what we're going to do. You don't mean that, don't I? Catherine opened her purse and withdrew a manila envelope thick enough to choke a horse. These are copies of bank statements, credit card records, hotel receipts, florist charges, and jewelry purchases going back 18 months. My attorney has been very thorough. Margaret's respect for Catherine Blackwell increased exponentially. This woman hadn't just discovered her husband's infidelity. She'd been building a case against him. You hired a private investigator, Richard said, and for the first time, he sounded truly afraid. I hired several, very discreet, very professional. They've documented your affair with Vanessa Morrison, your attempted affairs with at least 3 other employees, and your pattern of using company resources to fund your extramarital activities. Catherine smiled sweetly. They've also been monitoring your communications, your travel patterns, and your meeting schedules. Richard sank into his chair as if someone had removed his skeletal system. What do you want? Justice, Catherine said simply. And a very generous divorce settlement. And your complete withdrawal from any involvement in the day-to-day operations of this company. You can't do this to me. I can, and I will. You see, Richard, you made one critical error in your philandering. Catherine leaned forward, her eyes glittering with something that might have been satisfaction. You forgot that I own 47% of this company's stock. Margaret's brain performed rapid calculations. If Catherine owned 47% and Richard owned the majority, that meant, oh no. Combined with the stock options held by certain other parties, Catherine continued, I have more than enough voting power to remove you as CEO. What other parties? Richard's voice was barely a whisper. Catherine turned to Margaret with a smile that was absolutely terrifying in its warmth. Margaret, would you mind asking Jessica Chen to join us? I believe she's still in the building. Margaret's hand moved automatically toward her phone, but she hesitated. Mrs. Blackwell, I should mention that you've been working with Jessica to document Richard's behavior, that you have recordings and evidence of his attempt to coerce you into sexual compliance in exchange for career advancement. Catherine's smile became even brighter. Yes, dear, I know. Jessica and I have been coordinating our efforts for quite some time. The conference room door opened before Margaret could process this revelation fully, and Jessica Chen entered with the confident stride of someone who'd been listening at the door for the past 10 minutes. Mrs. Blackwell, Jessica said with a slight bow. Perfect timing, as usual. Jessica, thank you for joining us. I believe you have something that belongs to Mr. Blackwell. Jessica reached into her briefcase and withdrew a thick folder. Richard Blackwell's resignation letter, effective immediately, along with documents transferring his remaining stock options to a trust fund for his children's education. Richard stared at the folder as if it contained a live rattlesnake. I'm not signing anything. Oh, but you are, Catherine said gently. Because the alternative is a very public sexual harassment lawsuit, criminal charges for embezzlement of company funds, and a divorce proceeding that will make you the subject of every tabloid in the city. Margaret watched this unfold with growing amazement. She'd thought she was part of Jessica's plan to expose Richard, but Jessica and Catherine had apparently been orchestrating something much more comprehensive. The embezzlement charges won't stick, Richard said, but his voice lacked conviction. Won't they? Jessica opened her tablet and showed him a screen full of financial data. Company credit card used for personal expenses, $47,000 over 18 months. Corporate account used to pay for hotel rooms for personal use, $23,000. Company funds used to purchase gifts for non-business recipients, $15,000. She looked up at him with mock concern. Should I continue? Richard's face had gone from white to gray to a concerning shade of green. This is extortion. This is justice, Catherine corrected. And frankly, it's more generous than you deserve. You get to resign quietly, keep your pension, and maintain some shred of dignity. Your children get to think their father stepped down for health reasons, rather than because he's a predatory criminal. Margaret realized she was witnessing the complete destruction of a man who had, just 20 minutes earlier, been trying to coerce her into sexual compliance. The symmetry was almost poetic. What about the company? Richard asked weakly. The company will be fine, Catherine said. Jessica will be taking over as interim CEO while we search for a permanent replacement. Margaret will be promoted to Executive Vice President of Operations, with a salary commensurate with her actual value rather than what you were paying her. Margaret's jaw dropped. I'm sorry, What? You've been essentially running Richard's calendar, correspondence, and client relationships for 3 years, Jessica explained. We've been monitoring your work, and frankly, you're more qualified for executive leadership than half the people on our board. But I don't have an MBA or... You have intelligence, integrity, and 3 years of intimate knowledge of our operations, Catherine said firmly. Plus, you've just demonstrated remarkable courage in helping us expose a sexual predator. I can't think of better qualifications for leadership. Richard stood up abruptly, swaying slightly as if the room was spinning around him. You've all lost your minds. I built this company. I made it what it is. You inherited this company from your father, Catherine reminded him coldly. And you've spent the past 5 years trying to destroy it with your personal indiscretions and poor judgment. Consider this intervention. Jessica slid the resignation documents across the table. Sign them, Richard. It's over. Margaret watched Richard stare at the papers, and for a moment, she almost felt sorry for him. Then she remembered the weight of his hands on her shoulders, the predatory gleam in his eyes, the calculated cruelty of the coffee incident that had started this entire chain of events. There's one more thing, Margaret said quietly. Everyone turned to look at her. Margaret pulled out the recording pen and set it on the table next to the resignation papers. Everything that happened tonight is on here. Every word, every proposition, every attempt at coercion. Richard looked at the pen as if it was a cobra preparing to strike. Insurance, Jessica said approvingly. I like it. Catherine picked up an elegant fountain pen from her purse and set it next to the documents. Sign them, Richard. Sign them now, or I release everything to the press tomorrow morning. Richard looked around the room at the 3 women who had orchestrated his downfall, his wife, his head of HR, and the secretary he'd tried to victimize. Margaret could see the exact moment when he realized he had no choices left. He signed the papers. Excellent, Catherine said, gathering the documents. Jessica, please have security escort Mr. Blackwell to his office to collect his personal belongings. He has 30 minutes. As Jessica and Richard left the conference room, Richard looking like a man walking to his own execution, Catherine turned to Margaret with a smile that was warm, genuine, and slightly conspiratorial. I owe you an enormous debt of gratitude, Catherine said. Without your cooperation, we never would have gotten him on record making explicit propositions. Mrs. Blackwell, I have to ask, how long have you been planning this? Catherine's laugh was rich and satisfied. Since I found the hotel receipts 6 months ago, Jessica and I have been working together ever since. We knew Richard would eventually target another employee, and when he chose you, she shrugged elegantly. Well, you turned out to be the perfect partner for bringing him down. Margaret sank back into her chair, overwhelmed by the evening's revelations. So, the coffee incident. Was Richard following his usual pattern of creating dependency through humiliation? But it was also the beginning of the end for him. Catherine gathered her coat and purse. Margaret, go home. Take the weekend to process all of this. On Monday, you'll have a new office, a new salary, and a new set of responsibilities. I still can't believe you're making me an executive. Believe it, you've earned it. Catherine paused at the door. Oh, and Margaret? That recording pen uploads to a cloud server, doesn't it? Yes, ma'am. Good. Keep the backup safe. Richard may be signing resignation papers tonight, but men like him don't always stay resigned to their fate. After Catherine left, Margaret sat alone in the conference room, staring at the remnants of Richard's seduction dinner and trying to process the fact that her entire life had just changed in the span of 2 hours. Her phone buzzed with a text from Jessica. Congratulations, Madam Vice President. Drinks tomorrow to celebrate? Margaret typed back, only if you promise no more conspiracy theories for at least a week. Can't promise that. I'm already investigating the accounting department. But I'll buy the first round. Margaret gathered her things, including the recording pen that had captured Richard's downfall, and headed for the elevator. As the doors closed behind her, she realized she was smiling. Richard Blackwell had poured coffee on her head, thinking he was beginning a campaign of psychological manipulation that would end with her compliance to his sexual demands. Instead, he'd awakened a sleeping dragon, allied her with the two most dangerous women in his life, and engineered his own complete destruction. Margaret had always been good at survival, but it turned out she was even better at revenge. As the elevator descended toward the lobby, carrying her away from her old life as Richard's invisible secretary and toward her new life as an executive with the power to make real changes, Margaret realized that sometimes the best justice comes not from the legal system or corporate policies, but from underestimating the wrong women. Richard Blackwell would spend the rest of his life knowing that 3 women had outmaneuvered him so completely that he never even saw the trap until it had already closed around him. And Margaret Patterson would spend the rest of her career making sure that what happened to her, to Vanessa Morrison, and to who knows how many other women, would never happen again. The elevator reached the ground floor, and the doors opened onto Margaret's new life. She stepped through them without looking back. If you've made it this far, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and rate the story from 0 to 10. Your opinion is very valuable to us. Thank you.